Kim, thank you for being here. So, perhaps you've been hearing some of the discussion that we've been having about what investors need to consider here. We just heard Will McGough talk about capitalism coming back to Washington. That does seem to be the read-through from investors. What are you telling your clients on that front today?
Well, that thing certainly makes sense in the aftermath of the re-election of Donald Trump. At some point, Washington settles into doing its job, and that's after the apparatus of government has been established. So we would expect that between now and the end of the first quarter, President-elect Trump will give us more information on his plans on both fiscal policy and tariffs, each of which can be inflationary, each of which does have prospect for nicking the economy, certainly raising consumer prices. That's the modern and the long-term history of tariffs, is that they nick growth, they raise inflation, and they raise consumer prices. It's part of that inflation channel. And so I understand the notion that capitalism is returned to Washington, but it's very difficult to make a case that there's much that Washington can do to increase the attractiveness of the U.S. overall as a foreign direct investment locus. It's owned that champion's title for many years running now. The underlying economy, from a fundamental basis, top down and bottom up, is strong to better, and we expect that that comes through after the volatility of election uncertainty passes. We are in a period where that volatility is dropping off. Notably and understandably, there's an extra dollop in today's market, and that may last a few trading sessions. It may last longer, but a lot of that is the expected kickback you get after election volatility moves away.
What about deregulation, Kim? What do you think the path forward looks like there?
Complicated. I think, given the Supreme Court decision last year, Loper Bright, it's going to be quarters, if not years, according to every lawyer I speak to who practices administrative law, before you have a clear sense of whether or not any agency's regulatory rulemaking is going to survive judicial review. That's at the lower court level and ultimately all the way up to the Supreme Court finally. So my view, straightforward view, is that we're probably 6 to 8 quarters before we have a sense of who's in charge of deregulation in Washington, the courts or the executive branch and its agencies.
Kim, with regards to all of this and trying to figure out what's going to happen, the composition of the White House is going to be important beyond Donald Trump, obviously, who the cabinet is going to be, who his close advisors are going to be. Which positions are you watching most closely, and who do you think he could put in those positions?
Well, the first part of that question is a lot easier than the second part,
Yeah.
So I'll deal with that first. It is traditionally the case, and I think it will be given circumstances and president-elect's style, at least the style we knew when he was in office previously. There'll be a handful of people in the White House who matter. I would imagine the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff will matter a lot. But then it's always the big four, in no particular order: Treasury, Defense, Justice, State. You watch most keenly who ends up in those positions. If you're focused on international economic policy, obviously that's Treasury and State, and some commerce, obviously, especially when it comes to export controls. In terms of President-elect Trump and the Justice Department, there will be upheaval there, and so investors will be interested in that, but also in the tone of competition policy going forward. My guess is that if the underlying economy stays as strong as it is now for the foreseeable future, and in policy that's 2 quarters, your crystal ball really gives out after that, there's a signal to practitioners of M&A that the door is open again. The last 3 years consecutively, there have been fewer deals brought and fewer deals consummated because of the change in competition policy when Biden came to office. That will reverse itself hard, I think, once inauguration comes and the Department of Justice settles in its key leadership.
Kim, let's talk about the Federal Reserve for a moment. Of course, we're going to get an interest rate decision tomorrow, likely a quarter-point cut. But there's something to be said about the interplay between that and politics now as well, with President-elect Trump on the campaign trail talking about the independence of the Fed, raising questions about that. Some of his advisors sort of raising the idea of a shadow Fed chair, for example. What do you make of all that, and what should investors make of it?
I'll do this one reverse. I don't think investors should try to make too much of it right now. The facts are what they are, and that is that the Board of Governors is going to be a majority of Biden appointees until some of those people decide to step away, the chair or the other four governors that he appointed. In terms of policy making, I think Governor Waller was fairly straightforward 5-6 weeks ago in talking about presidents have a point of view, but they don't have a vote on the Open Market Committee. He was a little more forceful than that, but that's the message you get. And you have to keep in mind that the constituencies that are powerful in Washington, led by the top 25 banks of the country, they prefer consistency in their communications and expectations with the central bank. A lack of independence at the central bank would be viewed as potential threat to reserve currency status and a potential threat to monetary policy that might affect the economy. So I would say Washington usually talks a big game about the Fed, both from the left and the right, but very little comes of it. This going back to even Dodd-Frank back in 2010, when there was a lot of talk from the left of changing the way the Fed operated. There's structural, institutional pushback against denting the independence of the Fed.
Kim, thank you so much for your perspective. Appreciate it. We will indeed see if any of that comes to fruition this time around. Thank you.